Did you know that one night a policeman had to go to a mysterious farm where the lights and sounds shook the whole city? But after entering, what he saw was yours. It will spoil your sleep. That night the patrol radio was silent and I had almost finished my shift when the report arrived. It was about a lady who lived near the dirt road that leads to an abandoned farm, saying that she had seen strange lights and heard thuds coming from there like blows and drags of furniture. The Fazenda Silveira was known for its bad reputation. Everyone in town was talking about something strange things about this place, abandoned for years. The few who ventured there left always with stories of inexplicable noises or shadows at the windows. I took the car and headed towards the place. The dirt road was dark, surrounded by dense bush on both sides. The headlights illuminated only the dust raised by the patrol itself and the path in front of them, a narrow, deserted strip. The house appeared at the last bend as I remembered it, with cracked walls and covered with stains and mosses. The broken windows gave a feeling of complete abandonment, and the entrance was surrounded by tall grass, dense and dark. I parked near the entrance and got out, keeping the flashlight low. A glow, intermittent, came from a ground floor window, fading and reappearing as if it were from a badly connected light bulb. It did not look like something fixed, but rather like a disorderly flashing. I took a deep breath and walked over to the front door, which opened with a long, loud creaking. Inside the air was thick and gave off this strong musty smell, the smell of something that remained closed for a long time. I entered slowly, listening carefully. In a few minutes I realizing where the sound was coming from, a door ajar further away with the light flashing faintly below. It was the entrance to the basement. As soon as I got closer I heard the dull sound again, something heavy hitting the wood and a kind of dull whisper, an almost unintelligible voice that mingled with the sound of the blows. I slowly descended the basement steps, holding the flashlight. The space underneath was small and smelled of dust, and old furniture and boxes covered with dust were piled up along the walls, and a light bulb attached to the ceiling continued to flash, illuminating the room unevenly, but there was no one at each new blinking. I could see the dark and still empty basement. The noises had stopped the moment I came in, and everything was absurdly silent. That's when I noticed a mark on the opposite wall that looked like a hand, but not like an ordinary hand. The fingers were too long and curved in a strange way, like claws. I came closer, illuminating the mark, and the outline seemed recent with the dust around slightly out of place. I looked around, trying to figure out how it was there. There was no other access point, no windows and no secondary doors. I felt a shiver my back, and I decided not to waste any more time. I quickly went up the stairs, calling by radio reinforcements. As I was leaving the basement I was heading to the entrance, waiting for the others to arrive. When the reinforcements arrived, the silence on this dirt road became even more disturbing. It was two work colleagues whose jokes I used to hear on the myth of the Fazenda Silveira. When I explained to them the flashing lights, the strange sounds and the handprints on the wall, they both became serious. It seemed that just being there at night in the darkness of this old house took all the banter out of their minds. We got back, and the first thing they noticed was a thick and nauseous smell of humidity abounds. We walked in silence down the narrow corridor leading to the basement, and I noticed that all around us the shadows of the house seemed to expand and form, as if trying to cover the darkest corners. When we opened the cellar door the lamp was flashing again, but now the noises had completely stopped. I went down first, with one of my colleagues just behind and the other always near the entrance, pointing his flashlight, attentive to any movement. In the basement we found the same old boxes and furniture, but it was one of the walls that held my attention. There were new handprints distributed at different heights, and each one seemed More distorted than the previous one. The brands did not follow a common logic. Some were larger, others smaller, and some crossed each other as if something had passed through his hands slowly and deliberately. One of my colleagues pointed his flashlight at the ground, and we noticed scattered among the dust and debris of small shiny particles like shards of glass. Strangely, the shards were arranged in a thin line starting at the bottom of the stairs and ending right in the center of the basement where nothing justified it. It was as if something had fallen and broken at that place, but there was no sign of the object. The particles were just scattered, shining faintly at each flickering of the lamp. We studied the surroundings again, and it was then that my colleague at the door noticed something. He called me to tell me that he had seen something strange at the entrance in. Approaching, I noticed that there were small scratches scattered on the wood, some quite deep, as if it was about claw mark. The most disturbing detail, however, was that these marks were located both at the entrance and inside the door, suggesting that something or someone had entered and exited there. Several resumed without anyone having seen it. We had been there for more than an hour, and the lights of the house, except those from the basement, were completely extinguished. The lamp kept flashing, and the absolute silence was beginning to become suffocating. The sounds that I had heard before, the knocks and the whispers, had disappeared, but the air seemed heavier, almost palpable. I began to have the impression that something was watching us, something that could be there waiting for our third colleague, who stayed at the top, was the first one up the stairs, saying he would check the outside one more time. When we reached the ground floor, we heard the sound of the front door creaking, and shortly after, the sound of quick step on the hallway floor. We went out to follow him, but the night was empty. He walked around the house and saw nothing unusual. Everything seemed inert and quiet, as if the places had been abandoned for decades. After carrying out an additional search, we decided to record the incident and come back, but closing the cellar door, I felt a last shiver. There, on the wood of the door, there was another handprint, again long and irregular, but this time positioned exactly in the center, as if someone was pressing the door from the inside out. That night never left my mind, and even though no one said anything, it was as if everyone had seen more than necessary. The next morning, explanation was not given. When the day dawned, the air of the house seemed lighter, as if everything was returned to his place, but the feeling of discomfort was still present. The reinforcements that accompanied me during previous team have kept silent about what happened at the Fazenda Silveira, and even though I wanted to talk handprints of the lights and sounds, no one seemed willing to discuss. Everyone preferred to focusing on daily tasks, as if it were a passing episode that no longer deserved attention. I returned to the police station and filled out the reports, but the details did not leave me mind. What bothered me the most was the impression that somehow the house knew that we were there, that she was watching our steps, the handprints in the basement, the strange shine of the broken glass, and even the scratches on the door. None of them looked natural, but I was tired. It was easier to believe that I was creating a story in my head than admitting that something really out of place was happening on days. Then the routine returned to normal until a new complaint appeared. It was the same lady, Donna Marlene, who said this time that she had seen more light, but now in another part of the farm further away from the main house. At first I ignored it. I thought it was just his memory playing with time. However, something pushed me to return to the Fazenda Silveira, more out of obligation than for any other reason. The feeling that something was always there without it was constantly bothering me, like an intrusive thought that I couldn't get rid of. When I arrived, the house had a different look. The sun had not yet set, but the lighting of the sky gave everything a strange tone, as if the environment was frozen between day and night. The front door was ajar and the wind was rustling the broken curtains of the windows. The house once again was Silent, but something seemed to be waiting for me. I entered flashlight in hand and went straight to the basement. Nothing had changed, but the presence of stains on the walls made me stop. Now they were more dense, more visible, and more numerous, as if a strange presence had moved there, creating a marked path on along the wall. They were not simple handprints, they were deformed with thin fingers and elongated and seemed to extend beyond what the human anatomy could allow. I began to be agitated by starting to examine the brands more closely. I noticed that some of them were much more deep, as if something had scratched the walls with a force that I could not understand. While he looked at the noise, that same muffled sound of neck and whisper sounded again in the basement, but it didn't come from a specific direction. It seemed coming from everywhere, as if the house itself was making noise to attract attention. This feeling of being observed, which had already begun to haunt me on the first evening, was now stronger, clearer. The air was thick again, as if the house itself was taking shape, as if it had its own life. I spent some time there, but I didn't want to. No longer being alone, I returned to the police station with my mind full of questions and the feeling that somehow it wasn't over. There were days of turmoil until finally one of the youngest colleagues of the team is called to investigate another report, this time regarding an attempted action in a property on the outskirts of the city. But when he arrived there, he discovered something he couldn't explain. He had heard footsteps behind him as he was going through the house, and when he turned around there was no one. It was not uncommon, because several nights of the unsuspecting inhabitants of Boa Esperana ended up going to this place. However, the strangest thing happened. Produced when he went up to the basement, he said that the feeling of being followed was intense, but that what was really scary was to find the same marks on the wall, the same long handprints and deformed, that seemed to have been left there very recently. I still didn't know what to think about all this. Maybe the Fazenda Silveira has a history that we don't fully understand. Maybe the house was simply worn out by time and loneliness, creating its own illusions for those who approached it. Or maybe, as some have said in the city, that there is something in there, something that would not have, should never have been disturbed. What became clear to me is that nothing else at Fazenda Silveira would be the same. I knew it, just as I knew that a part of me would never be the same after these nights. That morning the highway was deserted. I was driving towards Valdlobos, a small isolated town inside Spain. It was my case at night, and the complete calm kept me on alert. At every turn the headlights illuminated the thick trees and the deserted road. But around 3:25 in the morning, as I arrived almost at the last bend, something unexpected caught my attention. There was a motionless figure on the edge of the road. I braked and the car stopped in almost absolute silence. At a few meters from me, a boy standing at the side of the road was looking at me without expression. He must have been at most 10 years old, thin and wearing a shirt that was too light for the cold of the time. The headlights of the police car reflected in his eyes that seemed dark and deep in the darkness. I stood silent for a moment, just watching, not knowing how a child could be there alone in a secluded place, and so late. I got out of the car slowly, taking my flashlight. As I approached, I noticed that he was barefoot and motionless. His skin was pale and his feet were covered with dust. It was as if he had not left anywhere, as if he had been there for hours waiting for something or someone. That I tried to say something. The boy turned around abruptly and started running, disappearing into the woods. Were by the side of the road. I turned on the flashlight and followed the direction he had taken. The noise of my footsteps was muffled by the earth and the dry leaves, and the beam of light passed through the darkness as I was trying to spot him through the trees. However, the boy was fast and agile, dodging the trees as if he knew the terrain better than I did. In a few seconds I completely lost sight of it. The air was freezing and The darkness seemed to thicken all around. I kept moving slowly, trying to hear a sound. But the silence was absolute, not even the wind or the noise of nocturnal animals. Just emptiness and darkness. As I started to back away, convinced that not finding it, I saw something strange on the ground next to a twisted tree with a thick trunk. It was an old backpack. And dirty, half buried under a layer of leaves and earth. I picked it up carefully by turning the lamp up. Pocket on it. The leather was worn with small cracks and the metal clasp was rusted. Apparently the backpack had been there for a long time, but something still seemed intact. In the bottom corner there was a name written, Lucas E. My stomach tightened. Lucas Escuero. It was the name of a boy who had disappeared years before in the same region one remember well from. The case is one of the first disappearances that I worked on as a police officer. Tragedy that marked the city. Lucas disappeared on a Sunday afternoon, and despite incessant searches, helicopter, dog, Renus flower volunteer from all over the city, no clues have been found. Name remained known for weeks until hope faded and the city returned to normal. The case is classified as one of the many unexplained disappearances. This backpack was there in front of me, dirty and abandoned, and all I was thinking was that I might have just seen Lucas himself, even though I knew he would be much older. This eventuality made me uncomfortable. I examined the backpack more closely. Inside there were notebooks and pieces of paper, but the wear and tear was so great that the contents were unrecognizable. I kept the backpack with me, feeling the weight of this strange discovery. When I came back to the car, I looked again at the deserted and dark road, expecting to see the boy standing somewhere at the far away, but the night was empty. I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts every second. My certainty was perhaps diminishing, that I had imagined everything the fatigue of the hours spent on the road could have triggered a hallucination, but the backpack I had in my hands was a concrete reminder of a disappearance. Tragic that the city had never been able to solve. Before leaving, I threw a last look at the roadside, lighting up the bushes and trees with my flashlight, but the silence remained absolute. There was no sign that anyone was there except for the old backpack full of dust and memories that I held tightly. I spent the whole morning thinking about what had happened. I didn't talk to no one about what had happened, but Lucas Escuero's backpack was always with me every moment. The memory of the boy I saw on the side of the road in the early morning was mixed with the idea that I might have everything imagined but the backpack, the name written on the aged leather, and the memory of that face in the headlights did not leave me alone. At the police station, I went directly to the file. The old affairs section was in a dimly lit basement room, and even less. The case of Lucas and Scudero was among the countless files of disappearance classified as unsolved case. I remembered the details, but I still revisited everything line by line as if I could find something new. According to the file, he was 10 years old at the time of his disappearance. He was wearing a blue shirt and sneakers and had been seen for the last time leaving a house near a forest about 5 kilometers from the road where I found it. I passed time flipping through the documents. There were photos of the family and the search of witness reports and detailed lists of the places searched, but no concrete traces, no solid clues. It was as if the boy had simply disappeared into thin air. The backpack did not appear in any of the folders as a lost or found personal object. It was as if she too had been forgotten until this morning. I spent the rest of the day at work, but the image of the boy standing on the road and the memory of the race to the forest never left my mind. Once my shift was over, I got back on the road at nightfall, and the same feeling of worry returned. In the darkness, the headlights of the car illuminated the narrow strip of road, and the trees seemed to be tightening around them. I drove slowly, looking carefully on both sides. As if I was hoping to see him again. When I reached the point where I had first seen him, I stopped the car. The road was deserted and completely silent. I went out. And I started walking as I had the night before. The forest by the side of the road was dense with trees with thick trunks and almost impenetrable intertwined branches. I have walked a few meters inside trying to recognize the path, but the forest seemed different to me. More closed and darker. I ended up losing myself in the memory of the chase of the previous night, and without realizing it I was deeper in the woods than expected. Suddenly I noticed that the surroundings were unusually quiet. The sound of my own footsteps seemed muffled, and there was no wind nor the distant sound of animals. The forest seemed frozen in time with the air heavy and motionless around her. I continued to walk slowly, pointing the flashlight at the ground and its while I saw something else that made me stop. In a clearing a little further away, something was shining at the moonlight that was escaping through the leaves. I approached slowly and saw a piece of fabric half buried in the ground. It was a piece of blue fabric, discolored by time and dirt but still visible. I picked up the fabric and realized that it was an old and deteriorated children's t-shirt. I remembered Lucas's description of what he was wearing the last time we saw him, and a shiver ran down my spine. I stayed there holding the piece of cloth, not knowing if it made any sense. How one of could his clothes have been so close to the road and gone unnoticed for so long? I kept it with me to find some logic in it, but all I felt was a strange and growing feeling that I was somewhere I shouldn't be. That same evening I came back to the police station with the piece of fabric in his hand and Lucas's backpack still stowed in the car. I went to my office and closed the door, knowing that I had to deal with all this in a logical way, but the truth is that I was beginning to doubt my own reason. The blue fabric seemed to have been there for years, discolored and soaked in dirt, but it was there that no one had found anything for all the time that they were looking for the boy. I thought that after so many years of work I was immune from being shaken by an unsolved case, but for a reason. If Lucas was becoming an obsession, I sat down in front of the computer and I began to examine the digital files of missing persons in search of clues that I could have miss. Even if I tried to rationalize, a part of me believed that I had actually seen the boy, or at least something that looked like him. I thought about checking the security camera files of the highways, but I knew that over there in this isolated and unlit area there were no cameras on. The last hope was that a driver saw something, but no report was issued. No one but me seemed to have crossed this road that morning. The next morning brought me an even deeper fatigue. I tried to ignore the feeling that I needed to get back on the road to the same place where it all started, and to observe once more, as if it would bring some clarity. That afternoon before dark, I took the car and left. When I reached the road, I stopped at exactly the same place where the boy had appeared, with the backpack and the piece of fabric still with me. This time I decided to walk along the road trying to find other traces, but there was only the dry leaves, the earthy smell, and the absolute silence of the forest. I couldn't get past the first row of a tree, and something in the darkness of this place seemed to push me back like an invisible barrier. I looked around, but everything seemed too ordinary. After hours of aimless walking, I decided to getting back to the vehicle. As I was about to get into the car, I heard a low noise coming from the forest. It was a light sound, like small quick steps, the same sound I had heard when I was trying to following the boy. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I stood still, listening to the sound gradually disappear until silence reigned again. I had the impression of being lost in a nightmare. The days dragged on then, and the case was again forgotten as a vague and uncomfortable memory. No one has ever mentioned Lucas Escuero again, and I have no longer mentioned the case. But since then, one thing has been on my mind every night when I Come home I feel his presence, the backpack and the piece of fabric remains stored in my closet, proof of something I don't understand yet. Well, my service at the SFOE police station was most of the time a repetitive routine. The city is small, quiet, so the work ended with a call sequence to solve small problems, brawling in bars, bike theft, neighborhood conflict. I was there for a little over a year, still in the adaptation period, and this calm ended up being almost comforting, but sometimes the calm gave way to a strange discomfort, as if the time in this police station was passing slower than in the rest of the world. That Friday evening I had to clean up the storage room and the proofing room. A job that few people wanted to do with it, but that Sergeant Kruger left me without batting an eye. He said that this type of work taught discipline and patience. It was something that no one really wanted, but I knew that refusing it would be a bad start for my career. I arrived around 10 a.m. and got ready for the work. The test room was located in an isolated corridor, an uncrowded space that looked more like a basement than an extension of the police station. The smell of dust and aged materials filled the air, mixed with the cold and metallic smell of the old shelves. Here were documents and objects from cases that had been archived decades ago and which for some reason had never been removed at the time. I thought it was an exaggeration, especially since many of these cases had already been solved and forgotten. I spent a few hours at clean and labeled to organize the boxes and to check the inventories. Some elements caught the attention. There was a broken wristwatch covered with a light layer of dust, an old pair of glasses with scratched glass, and some identity cards of missing people who apparently have never been removed from the room. I had a strange thrill when I touched some of these things. In case like this, it was hard not to wonder what had really happened to these objects, that were the people behind them, and why they had been there for so long, waiting for someone who would never come back to look for them. It was while tidying one of the back shelves almost around midnight that I discovered something unusual. It was a worn identity card and an old police badge. The piece identity card was yellowed and stained with discolored edges, as if it had been handled several times before being stored there. I looked carefully and I saw that the name on the document was Hans Eberhardt. The photo showed a man in his 30s with dark hair, black, and with a serious expression. He was wearing a uniform in the image, but despite this he looked tired, like someone who was carrying more than he should have. The date of issue on the ID said it was 1977. I found it strange, but what really bothered me was the badge that was next to it. It was a badge of the SFOE police, but it had a different design from the ones we use today, with almost faded golden details on. Piece was surprisingly cold, colder than anything I played that night, as if I had spent too many s in a place where the heat does not reach. I thought there was a story behind this name, so I brought the ID and the badge to the archives area to check the history. I searched in the system the name Hans Eberhardt, and I found after a few minutes an entry. Old and short, the only information was missing in service with a date November 1978. The report contained no details about the disappearance, just a note dry indicating that he had disappeared while investigating a homicide case. The last time they got word from Berard, he was in the woods outside of town investigating a lead. After nothing more. No information, no reports, no other leads. I felt a strange sensation thinking about his face on this old photo. It was a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. I had never heard of Hans Eberhardt, and no one at the station mentioned old cases. That night the police station was empty. There may have been someone on duty at the reception, but I was completely alone in this corridor. I went back to the proof room, still holding the badge, trying to think about how such an object Had been forgotten for so long. I continued the cleaning, but the work was no longer going as before. From time to time I take a look at the shelf where I had left the badge and the identity card of Hans Eberhardt. As if I was hoping that some details would go unnoticed. Around 2 a.m. as I was finishing, I started to hearing a slight noise, something that did not fit with the silence of the building. The noise was subtle, but it seemed to come from the corridor of slow and irregular steps, as if someone walked slowly. The acoustics of the police station made the sound resonate in such a way that it was difficult to know where exactly it came from. I stopped and listened, wondering if it was simply from a plumbing noise or something else common in an old building, but the footsteps continued in a strange and intermittent rhythm, almost as if someone was hesitating at every step. I tried to ignore it and to return to work, but the footsteps did not stop. They seemed to be getting closer, becoming clearer and clearer. After a few minutes the sound suddenly stopped. I was alone. The room was silent, just the slight sound of the wind outside. I looked around expecting to see something different, but everything was the same. I grabbed my things, closed the door of the proof room and prepared to get out of there as quickly as possible. By crossing the corridor, I felt a shiver run down my spine, realizing that along the way the ground presented slight traces of dirt, like footprints that didn't exist before. They weren't mine. They were larger, with a deeper footprint, as if someone was wearing heavy boots. Old ones used by the police officers. I arrived at the reception. I dropped off my keys and left but as soon as possible I knew that this was only the beginning of a story that I might not want to know. After that night I became agitated. I tried to put aside what had happened at the police station, but something about this badge and Hans Eberhardt's photo haunted me. I found myself thinking about his case at random moments, as if the face of that missing policeman never left my head. I didn't say anything to Sergeant Kruger nor to my other colleagues. I thought it would be useless, and maybe he would even think that I was crazy to say that I had heard footsteps and seen footprints that were not mine. However, even without talking about it, my work schedule at the police station began to take on a strange atmosphere. Corridors seemed darker, the colder rooms, as if there was a presence that no longer belonged to the world of the living, but who insisted on staying there during the day. The police station was just an ordinary and empty building. But at night he seemed engulfed by a different darkness, a kind of silence that echoed my thoughts. I had to work the night shift again the next Friday. I walked into the building around 11 a.m. and one of the first things I noticed was the same strange cold I felt when I touched the badge. A slight cold breeze was circulating even with all the windows and doors closed. I put on my coat, trying to ignore this feeling, and I went straight to my office where some routine tasks had been left. Business was going on as usual until, by checking the register of evidence, I noticed that the identity card and the badge of Hans Eberhardt appear there, but with a new mentioned proof on file. I knew that I had left them both in the proof room the week previous. However, a morbid curiosity made me go back to confirm. When I opened the door from the room, the light flickered for a few seconds before stabilizing, and there on the back shelf was my identity card and my badge, exactly as I had left them. It made no sense. No one else had no access to the evidence, and there would be no reason for anyone to have moved the cases from this old case. I approached and noticed something strange in the badge, a slight chip in the metal, as if it had been recently polished, which was unlikely given the condition in which I have it found. While holding the object, the same cold enveloped me. Then I heard it was almost like a low, harsh whisper, something that seemed to come from inside the room, but that disappeared at the moment when I was trying to concentrate my hearing. I tried to convince me that it was just the sound of my own footsteps that echoed in the acoustics of this place, but the whisper seemed human. I spent the rest of my shift trying to avoid the room, but every time I was alone in the corridor, the feeling of being observed grew. My eyes were fixed on the shadows, and any minimal noise seemed amplified. Shortly after 2 a.m., as I was about to close the police station, I heard something more from the blades and dragging coming from the corridor of the test room. I took a deep breath and I decided to investigate. I walked slowly, the flashlight in hand, observing every detail around me. The steps stopped before my arrival, but there was something different in the air. The smell of dust common in this place now seemed mixed to something metallic, almost like oxidized blood, an odor that made me nauseous and filled me with a strange and cold anxiety. I reached the door of the proofing room and hesitated. There was no light, so I opened the door slowly and pointed the flashlight. The beam of light illuminated the lower shelf, and my heart bent down to see that the identity and the badge was gone. I went in and looked around, but there was no sign of any of the objects. It seemed impossible. I was sure that I had left them there. I left the room quickly with the feeling that something was watching my movements. As I closed the door, I heard another low sound, a sound that does not fit into the empty environment. It was a heavy and slow breathing that seemed to come from the end of the corridor. I felt my whole body frozen. I forced myself to look in this direction. The light from the corridor was dim, and for a while I had the impression of seeing a tall and motionless figure with broad shoulders and upright posture. As a person in a guard position, I blinked, and when I looked again there was nothing but the silence was deep, almost suffocating. I turned around and went back to my table. I stayed there a moment trying to decide what to do, but I knew no one would believe me. I waited until my shift work is over. I got my business and I left with the image of this figure still alive in the mind. In the following days I did some research on the disappearance from Hans Eberhardt. I found that he was known as a strict and disciplined policeman that respected by everyone world in the city, but during the case where he investigated before disappearing, some reports mentioned that he had become strange, saying that he felt that he was being followed. There were rumors about a suspect that he could never identify, someone who, according to Eberhardt, looked at him in the shadows and seemed to know all his steps while playing his old records. A feeling of despair came over me. It was as if the disappearance of HN and Berhardt had left a mark at the police station, a dark path that crossed in some just in time. That night back at work I went into the evidence room again. I wanted to understand what was going on, but when I arrived I found the door ajar, as if someone had already entered. I went slowly with the same shiver down my spine. Looking at the back of the room, I felt my stomach turn over. There on the shelf, the identification and the insignia was in the same place where I had left them earlier that night. My mind was in conflict between fear and curiosity. Thing inside me said it was crazy, but another part knew I had to figure out what was going on. The story of Hans and Berard and the presence of this distinctive character have pursued me in the last days. I spent the next time tried to continue the work, but the feeling that there was something watching me would not leave my thoughts. At about 2 a.m. I was convinced that something at the police station wanted to be found. That's when I started listening to the same slow and dragged step like last time. They echoed in the room as if someone was waiting for me to hear. I felt a chill, but this time I followed the sound. I went into the corridor where the room was located, striving to stay calm. The steps stopped as soon as I got near the door. I looked around and everything was silent, the kind of oppressive and charged silence that only increases the tensions. With a tremor I opened the door and illuminated the atmosphere with my flashlight. In the background, the Hans badge and the ID card remained at the same untouched place, but now there was something different about the identity card. I saw a recent dark spot like a moisture mark, but thick and almost black. I felt the metallic smell that only old blood has, and I left. I closed the door, unable to bear what it meant. I looked at the empty corridor, and the silence was almost unbearable. It was then that the door to the evidence room was closed slowly but firmly. Alone, my heart beat. I tried to open it, but I was locked. I took a step back, then I heard a heavy and slow breathing very close to me. The sound seemed to come from all sides, louder and louder, as if something was surrounding me. My flashlight started to fail, and for a few seconds I was standing there, stuck between fear and panic. When the light came back, something made me look down the hall. There had a tall figure with a rigid posture, broad shoulders, and a look who seemed to be walking through the darkness. He was wearing an old police uniform with a past gold badge, and the face was the same as I saw it on Hans Berhardt's photo. I was paralyzed. The figure didn't move, just hit me. Looked with a fixed and heavy look. The silence was absolute, and every second seemed to be spreading out. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes it was only no longer there, but the breathing continued around me like a living shadow. I took a step back, trying to convincing myself it wasn't real, but something inside of me knew it was. I managed to get out of the hallway, and I went back to my table, trying to get my breath. I waited until dawn, unable to move. When the first policeman in the morning came, I didn't say anything. I got up and left. Since then I haven't returned to the police station.